In 2024, the cities of Mannheim and Solingen became synonymous with a specific type of violence. High-profile knife attacks at public gatherings and political events left multiple victims dead and sent a wave of fear across Germany. Political parties, led by the Alternative for Germany, moved quickly to define the cause. They argued the violence was the direct result of migration, framing the knife as the primary weapon of a loss of border control. The Federal Criminal Police Office, or BKA, released a figure that seemed to confirm the worst fears: 29,000 knife attacks recorded in a single year. This put Germany's violent crime rate at its highest level in 15 years. In response, cities across the country established Waffenverbotszonen. These are weapon-free zones, often centered around train stations, where police have the authority to stop and search anyone to confiscate knives and other prohibited items. This specific number, 29,000, now dictates national security policy. However, a close look at how the police actually count these incidents reveals that the data does not support the public's perception of the threat. Deconstructing the official police reports shows that the reality of the knife epidemic is quite different from the descriptions found in political speeches and news headlines. To understand the 29,000 incidents, we have to look at the BKA's technical definition. A knife attack is recorded whenever a knife is used to either physically strike someone or to threaten them. When the data is broken down, 43% of these cases, over 12,000 incidents, are classified as bedrohungen or threats. These involve a knife being shown or mentioned to intimidate someone, but they involve no physical contact and no injury. The cases that define the public sphere, murder and manslaughter, account for 3.2% of the total. This tiny fraction includes every completed killing as well as every unsuccessful attempt. This creates a disconnect. The majority of the data involves non-physical threats, yet the fear is of constant lethal violence. Media researcher Thomas Hesterman tracked thousands of news reports to see how the press covers these statistics. In the news reports Hesterman analyzed, over half of the knife attacks described were fatal. In reality, the BKA's data shows the actual fatality rate is 0.4%. The frequency of lethal attacks in the news is over 100 times higher than their frequency in real life. This pattern of reporting prioritizes the rarest, most violent outcomes. As a result, the public's sense of danger is built on these statistical exceptions, rather than the routine reality of police work. This reporting also changes our perception of where danger exists. It focuses almost entirely on public life, train stations, parks, and city squares, leading citizens to believe the street is the most likely place for an attack. The data shows a different geographic concentration. Up to 80% of knife-related violence in Germany occurs in the domestic sphere, inside private homes and apartments. In these settings, a knife is rarely a premeditated weapon. It is a tool of opportunity during a domestic escalation. The victims are overwhelmingly women, and the perpetrators are most often their partners or former partners. By focusing so heavily on the fear of a stranger in a park, the national conversation misses the actual center of knife violence: the private living room. The demographic data is often the most contentious part of the debate. Non-German suspects account for roughly 1/3 of all knife attack suspects, a rate that is higher than their share of the general population. Criminologists point out that this is not a result of nationality, but of life circumstances. The migrant population is heavily concentrated in the demographic most likely to commit violent crime, regardless of background: young men living in low-income urban areas. Anonymous surveys of students suggest that carrying a knife is a broader cultural trend. Among German youths without a migration background, 31.3% admit to carrying a knife for status or protection. For youths with a migrant background, that number is actually lower, at 25.5%. Media coverage further skews this perception through what is called name bias. News outlets are significantly more likely to mention a suspect's background if they have a foreign-sounding name, while the 2/3 of suspects who are German citizens are rarely identified by their nationality. This selective framing turns a complex issue involving poverty and age into a political argument about migration. During debates in the Bundestag, speakers often claim Germany is facing an unprecedented collapse in public order, suggesting the country has never been more dangerous. The 1990s were actually deadlier, with higher rates of murder and manslaughter. The recent explosion in knife statistics is partly a result of record-keeping. The BKA only created a uniform national category for knife attacks in 2020. Before that, these incidents were simply absorbed into broader crime categories. However, there is a real trend in the data. Since 2022, violent crime has risen. Following the end of pandemic restrictions, social conflicts in public spaces have become more likely to escalate into physical fights. There is also a small number of attacks, less than 1%, that function differently. These are ISIS-inspired terror attacks. They use knives because they are cheap, legal to buy, and capable of causing the specific type of public panic that terrorists seek. These rare, asymmetrical attacks have a psychological impact that the broader statistics cannot measure. They are what ultimately change how people feel when they walk through their own cities. This creates two different realities. One is a post-pandemic rise in aggression and a small, lethal terror threat. The other is a media-driven narrative of a generalized knife epidemic that does not match the police records. To address this second reality, leaders are proposing laws that would reclassify every knife threat as a severe crime. This would force judges to issue harsher sentences, regardless of whether anyone was actually hurt. Criminologists argue that these laws will not work. Abstract legal changes do not influence a person in the middle of a domestic argument or a radicalized attacker who does not expect to survive the day. The risk of this legislative focus is that it diverts attention from the real problems. It prioritizes the appearance of safety in public squares, while underfunding the social services and domestic abuse protections that address where the violence actually happens. Addressing public safety means looking past the headlines and toward the complex, often unsexy work of social policy. Fighting a perceived phantom may win votes, but it won't make the living rooms or the streets any safer.